Hello, this is the first in a series of videos for the FY27 budget series for Franklin West. I'm going to try to put together a whole bunch of videos that are short in nature, give as much information as we can so that when you make a decision about supporting the school, you have full information when you vote on town meeting day or before. We'll get into that. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is John Tague. I'm the superintendent of Franklin West Supervisory Union, serving the students of Fairfax, Fletcher, and Georgia. So this first video is an overview of Vermont's education funding system. This is one video that will be shared with all three schools. Future videos will be specific to each school. So let's get started. So the piece that you need to understand is how the education tax rates are set. At least that's what I'm hoping that I can explain to you, how this whole system works in Vermont. So in Vermont, districts create and approve budgets. So your local school board works with the Franklin West Supervisory Union office to determine typically what we do as a level services budget. And we look at what the cost basically to continue the services that we provide will be for another year. So districts throughout the state are doing that process, send their numbers to the state, and the total of all the budgets that are presented and approved by boards is what determines the size of the education fund. So the education fund isn't some fixed amount of money that the state says, here's how much money you have to spend. It works in Vermont the other way, where schools say, here's how much money we need, and then the legislature needs to figure out how to come up with that amount of money. And that is the struggle with the education finance system in the state that the legislature is working to approve or to improve, particularly through Act 73. So once we know how much money is in the education fund, the legislature has to determine how to raise the funds, and it's a combination of property taxes, sales tax, the lottery fund. There's a bunch of different sources that build up the education fund, but the piece that's relying on the property yield or the property tax is the homestead yield, and that's a number that is used in the calculation of a tax rate. So the homestead yield number the legislature sets, they basically try to figure out how do we raise enough money to meet the requests or the approved budgets of the various towns throughout the state. And how it affects this tax rate, how it affects tax rates. If the yield is smaller, your tax rates increase. If the yield increases, then your tax rates decrease. Currently, the governor has proposed putting a $105 million towards the education fund from other sources. That would reduce the tax rate because ultimately a new yield number will come from the state. We get an estimated one on December 1st in what's called the December 1st letter, oddly enough. And so if that 105 million that the governor has talked about comes to fruition, the yield will increase, which will result in a decreased tax rate. Don't know the exact numbers yet. So once we have the yield and we know how much the budgets are, we use the tax rates calculated by figuring out the spending per equalized pupil, divide that by the homestead yield, and that is what determines the actual tax rate. Spending per equalized pupil is essentially take the total education expenses, divide by the number of pupils, and that's where that spending per equalized pupil comes from. And that's the important piece that determines the tax rate. And the other piece is that it's not basically the number of beating hearts that are in the building. It actually has extra factors in it to account for the fact that some students take a little more funding to support their educational needs. We'll talk about that in another video, probably the next one that we make, and give you specifics for your town. So yes, I just said that the number of equalized people is different than the actual number of students enrolled. So that's the kind of the basic piece. And just by way of a quick example, if we just had three districts in the state, and District A, the green boxes would represent the current year spending FY26. So District A is 20 million, District B is 15 million, District C is asking for 10 million. That makes the size of the education fund $45 million. And the legislature would need to come up with a yield number to be able to raise $45 million. Now, as districts are building their FY27 budget, let's say District A says we need another $500,000. District B says we're going to keep level funded, not do anything. And District C says we are going to reduce our funding, reduce our expense by $250,000. What that means is based on this simpler model, the actual education fund in the state has increased by $250,000. And so the legislature would need to come up with a yield number that would raise $45,250,000. So District C that saw a decrease in spending, decrease in their budget, would actually probably see a slight tax increase because the ed fund is going to have to raise more money. District B that kept a stable budget is also probably going to see a tax increase because of the impact of the overall spending in the state. And District A that added $500,000 is also going to see a tax increase, but probably not at the extent of their $500,000 increase. And so that's sort of the struggle in the current system, is that your increases in spending don't necessarily reflect directly to a tax rate. There are about 4 different ways that your tax rates will change. One is based on spending across the state and obviously spending within your district, paying for non-pre-K to 12 instructional items out of the ed fund. So for instance, PCB testing, radon testing, Act 166 pre-K payments, those are all pieces that don't necessarily reflect on educating students that do come out of the ed fund. The other ways are the changes in your property value compared to the state. That's the CLA, the common level of appraisal. So depending on how your town's house values change relative to the state's, you'll see your property tax change. And then there's the change in the number of students compared to the state, and that's that equalized pupil count, which again, next video we'll talk about that specifically for your town. So again, going to editorialize, but the problem with the funding system in Vermont is that it's not predictable. It's based on what people want to spend rather than, ideally many other states say this is how much you get per student. That is a part of Act 73, that there will be a payment made based on the number of students, and that's what budgets the towns have to figure out how to live within. But right now, the system is unpredictable, and there is not a direct relationship between spending and tax rates. So we'll get into that as future videos go on. Just want to talk about this video, the education funding system. The next one will be talking about the long-term weighted average daily membership, talk about class sizes, staffing ratios, Act 73 and return on investment. There'll be some specifics about your budget, and then ultimately the tax calculation and the household impact will be the last in the series. I'm going to try to get those all to you before February 11th when early voting begins. This is the information about when your information meetings are in each of your towns and when voting day is. So I appreciate you taking the few minutes to watch this video. Please reach out if there are questions or anything that we can help with, and be on the lookout for the next in the series of videos. Thanks. Have a great day.